This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 438, The Backyards of Baker Street. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you spending a lot of time in your backyard this time of year?
I'm spending a lot of time in my front yard. But you know, Watson would have called it the back garden, wouldn't he? I mean, I don't know about
He would
use
have.
Use of the term backyard. That's a very American-y thing, I think.
It is, isn't it? And yet this piece was written by Bernard Davies, who is very clearly a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. And you know that because he pronounces his name Bernard, not Bernard.
Have you spoken to him and had him correct you?
Not recently. Not recently. But I'm just going on what it looks like. It looks like Bernard.
Bernard, yeah, it does. Yeah.
Bernard Davies. Well, this is another episode of Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist themed episodes. We do this in the third week of every month. We look at a piece of old scholarship, kind of resurrect it from obscurity and talk about it with you, our dear listeners, just to give you a sense as to how Sherlockians have addressed various trifles in the Sherlock Holmes stories over the years. So stay with us because we're going to be investigating this piece together. Meanwhile, wanted to remind you that if you'd like to support the show, there are two ways to do that, primarily through Patreon and Substack. Just go to, patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. There are a couple of different structures there, but either way, it's a recurring subscription, or you can do an annual pledge, and we give you, in return for your generosity, bonus content. We recently embarked upon the Trifling Trifles series, where we look at things that are maybe too short to discuss in a full episode here. And, of course, every month we do a drawing. All of our supporters are automatically entered for a chance to win a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. So if that sounds appealing to you, check it out on Patreon and Substack and see how you might like to support the community and get involved in the discussions that we have on those platforms. Well, we are heading into the backyards of Baker Street. I don't know if that's properly called the Mews or the Gardens or which, but maybe we'll figure it out as we plod through this. This is the final chapter of a book called 17 Steps to 221B, edited by James Edward Holroyd. This book was produced really at the height of a lot of Sherlockian scholarship in 19... Oh, goodness, it's later than I thought. It was in 1967. I thought this was back in the early 50s. 67. And it is a compilation of 17 different chapters from authors of all types. And we are looking at the final chapter by Bernard Davies.
Indeed. And stopping on Bernard Davies for a moment is a really good thing to do. Bernard Davies was a remarkable fellow. He was, among other things, he was an actor. He appeared in the 1960s in Patrick McGowan's show Secret Agent. He was in Doctor Who. He wasn't, a particularly well-known actor, I don't believe, but he was a great Sherlockian. He was the grandson of a metropolitan police inspector who was stationed at Marylebone, right by Baker Street. And he enlisted in the Royal Artillery in the 1940s. Most of his war years were spent in India. After the war, he returned to the theater. He became a player in weekly repertory companies. He could speak 6 languages, and for a while he was much in demand to play foreign types, usually Nazi officers, in war films. In the 1950s, he won £6,000 on the British version of 21, and which was a game show. And his name used to be in the Guinness Book of World Records in those days as the winner of the largest cash prize ever on a British TV quiz show.
Really?
Around that time, you could buy a good house in Britain for £2,000. He won £6,000. And around then, in 1958, he discovered Sherlock Holmes. He'd been a great fan of Sherlock Holmes, but he discovered the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. And that's when he began writing about things like, was Holmes a Londoner? And this essay, The Backyards of Baker Street. And he was a unique individual. He wrote about his own writings. He said, "None of my first 5 efforts were really case studies, and only 2 of them could be considered topographical. 3 dealt intimately with parts of Victorian London, and the 4th took rail travel as its principal theme." And so this whole idea of location and identification was something he was very interested in. So he's a great irregular, one of the greats.
That's fantastic. I had no idea about all that. And and looking a little deeper here, with fellow actor
Whiteman.
Bruce Whiteman,
Yeah.
he founded the Dracula Society in 1973.
Sure.
How do you like that?
It's the only way you can be sure of getting into Romania, to visit the right locations.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're not going to discuss all of Davies' piece in detail because he does give a lot of backstory, a lot of details about other investigations. But the premise is this. 221B Baker Street, its location has been contested over the years, and there have been many Sherlockians who have either been native to England or who have traveled to England to walk up and down Baker Street and try to pinpoint exactly where 221B was and where Camden House, the empty house, was. And this is part of what has motivated Bernard Davies for this particular piece. And he said he was reminded of this perennial fascination of the mystery of 221B by a perusal of James Edward Holroyd's delightful birthday book for unbelievers, Baker Street Byways. And he used that as his jumping off point. This is the centenary of Holmes, he said, had come and gone with no less than 3 commemorative plaques to mark his passing. And in Baker Street, there's no tribute to its most famous inhabitant. And it's a sobering thought because so many Sherlockians are fascinated with the obscurities of the canon, particularly when made plain to them. But surely this is an exception, the one mystery we should all wish to solve, if only to avoid that acute embarrassment when asked to point out the home of Holmes.
And Davies starts this particular essay by reviewing all of the prior scholarship, in a paragraph or 2. He starts, of course, with Dr. Gray Chandler Briggs. Now, the good thing about what he does here is that you could spend a lot of time reading all this stuff. But what he does is he sort of sums it up into 3 main groups. So Dr. Gray Chandler Briggs plumped solidly for number 111 Upper York Place and its opposite number, Camden House School, at number 118. And Vincent Starrett liked that particular identification of where Baker Street and where Camden House would be. And then in another group, which Davies calls the fundamental or Holmes without tears school, they stick to the now demolished number 221 and perpetuate the quaint fiction that Holmes happily anticipated renumbering by some 30 years, because, of course, in Holmes's day, there was no 221. And then in the last group, there are the strained semantics of Dr. Maurice Campbell and the dubious topography of Mr. James Hyslop about number 19 Baker Street and about number 27 Baker Street. And Gavin Brand, is kind of in that group too. He selected numbers 59 to 63, Blandford, north of Blandford Street, and Michael Harrison, was sort of in that case. So,
and we should mention that as we were looking through this preamble here with all of these different identifications, we came across, was it Mr. Ernest Short selected
right.
number 108, which was the present YWCA hostel as the empty house. And we did a quick search and we found that, well, that is the location of the Holmes Hotel on Baker Street, which occupies 108 through 114 Baker Street. And you can actually stay at this hotel. It is very, very lightly themed Sherlock Holmes. I think it's been redone. It used to be very heavily influenced by Sherlock Holmes, but now it's very subtle. But it is a wonderful 4-star hotel that if you plan to travel to London, well, you can stay on Baker Street just like Sherlock Holmes.
Well, in this essay, Davies gives us all of these different groups and solutions and investigations into the location of 221B and Camden House. And we can save you 4 pages of reading that by skipping right to his beginning of his own argument. He says, we may list the following essential requirements for these 2 buildings. So let's get started, he says. The empty house. Well, first of all, there's the back. It must have had a mews or a similar passage behind it giving access to the rear premises. No house without one can be accepted. Number 2, it must have possessed a backyard abutting onto this mews. As the back door opened into this yard, the latter must have been an open space at the rear, not a small enclosed court or an air well within the building. And then 3, this is the last point about the back, Holmes and Watson passed through a wooden gate from the mews into the yard, and therefore there was no mews property intervening.
Well, then we go around the front of this, the empty house. Its front door and entrance hall must have been on the south side, in other words, on the right when viewed from the street, because Holmes suddenly turned to the right into the front room when approaching from the rear. Impossible if the hall was on the north. And there was no street lamp outside it in 1894. From the direct quote, there was no lamp near. So that's front and back of the empty house.
And then we get to 221B, and he starts with the back. It must have possessed a backyard large enough to contain a plane tree at the time of Thor Bridge. That's 1900 or so. The tree may not have been very large, but the October wind, quote, whirling the last remaining leaves from its branches suggests that it was of reasonable height and foliage. The yard, therefore, was fairly spacious and open to the wind. Both factors, together with the phrase, behind our house, rule out a narrow well or court within the building, so a large backyard, at least large enough to contain a plane tree.
And then, of course, the front of 221B. Here are the some numerous points, but none are of any practical use. A, 2 large windows in the sitting room. Few Baker Street houses are only 2 windows width across, but we can't be certain how far across the frontage the room extended at that period. B, there was a bow window. At no time does any house appear to have had such a window. This is dubious and may be a literary fancy at best. It was probably an ephemeral device. C, at least 3 stories high, as Watson slept on a floor above. All the original buildings have at least 3 floors. D, the front door possessed a semicircular fanlight. This, in some form, was practically universal. And E, the main staircase had 17 steps up to the first landing. My own researches confirm those of Dr. W.S. Bristow. All existing examples have about 20. Some more. Number 109 has 25. Now, A and B, that is the 2 large windows in the sitting room, and B, the bow window. A and B are so doubtful, and C and D, that's the 3 stories and the fanlight, are universal, while E, the steps, is so in conflict with the known facts that it is advisable to ignore the front elevation entirely and rely solely on point 1. Point 1 being the backyard description.
And then Davies turns to his resource here. He says, the Ordnance Survey. All our data concerning the empty house relates to the year 1894. And it was in this and the preceding year that they undertook the resurveying of the 5-foot to 1-mile plans of London, first published in the 1870s. So for our purpose, anything other than contemporary material is virtually useless. Published in 1895, the second edition, sheets 7/41 and 51, show Baker Street exactly as it was at the time of the empty house. So with these maps before us, let us first appraise the value and limitations of certain evidence.
And the evidence is 1, the passage, and 2, the yard, are unassailable, and there can be no exceptions to them. Number 3, the gate. Now, here we strike a difficulty. From the map, it's obvious that the only yards opening directly out of the Mews passages east of Baker Street are near the entries. All of them belong to the houses in the streets running across Baker Street. No houses in Baker Street possessed such yards. In every case, some stable or similar building lay between the yard and the passage. We must accept this as fact. Watson must have omitted to mention that they passed through some Mews premises to reach the yard.
And then he takes us to number 4 here, the front doors. And, basically the positions of these are only indicated on the maps by the basement areas marked as remaining. And, it's not really useful. And so Davies talks about this a little bit, but he concludes, it's advisable to use this only as a secondary factor, the front doors, in order to eliminate buildings which might qualify on other grounds. And then he takes us to the street lamps. These were marked on the first edition of 1872, the Ordnance Map, but were unfortunately omitted from the second edition. So the data, the problem is how to decide how near to a lamp a house could stand without being disqualified. At least one house width away would seem to be a reasonable minimum, but the sightings vary in relation to the house fronts. So this, too, is probably just a secondary factor, and only to rule it out, otherwise unsuitable buildings which have a lamp immediately outside.
So he says, is again, as he follows that the main burden of identification rests on points 1 and 2. And just a reminder, points 1 and 2 were the passage and the yard. These he said were unassailable. So we have to eliminate any sections of the east side that are disqualified on point 1 alone. And he runs down exactly which those were. North of the Metropolitan Station, there were some either from Alsop Place or Marylebone Road. Numbers 126 to 136 York Place. No mews between these houses and the newly erected Portman mansions, et cetera, et cetera. So he excludes a whole bunch of addresses and says, now we're left with the blocks between Portman Mansions and George Street, including most of York Place. And there's a map on the end paper, and I'll see if we can get a screenshot of this, a nice shot, and we'll post it in the show notes so you can see exactly what it looks like. Maybe we'll use it for the cover art for this episode.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, he says all of these had rear passages, and we'll apply the same tests to all of them, whether the passages could be reached in a direct line from Blandford Street or not. Right, so he's relying on the physical construct of these passages. Again, relying on the gate and the passageway. The yard. Being unassailable, as well as the passage. So of these groups, the following had yards in the rear and immediately adjoining a mews, premises through which Holmes and Watson would have passed. York Place. He looks at numbers 98 through 120. None. There were none that were possible within 98 through 120 York Place.
Well, and then he steps us through the rest of these. Now, you can just imagine Bernard Davies sitting there at his kitchen table or dining room table with the ordnance map and a magnifying glass and his note paper and a pen, going through all of this and having a wonderful time.
Yeah.
As he begins by demolishing all the other theories and coming up with the minimum requirements. Now he's stepping through. And so he quickly eliminates these other things, Dorset Street to Paddington Street, Blandford Street to Dorset Street, George Street to Blandford Street, and keeps going through all of these. And now, again, we're just sort of looking at, the back here and says, okay, out of all the possible houses, likely and unlikely, the only conceivable choice for the empty house is number 34. And the following points are in its favor. First of all, its yard, 20 feet by 6 feet, ran behind the Blandford Street houses and was entered via a curious little mews property unlike any other in the street. A small shed hardly wider than the yard and sandwiched in between the two premises of the usual size. It might easily have seemed a mere tunnel into the yard beyond and caused Watson to give the impression that no typical mews building intervened. Whether there was a gate at this period, we don't know. Also, it was the first yard on the right. This fits the narrow passage far better than the stretch of mews nearly 30 feet wide. And, that's basically it. So here we are, Blandford Street, number 34.
And he continues to pick apart Gavin Brenn's approach and nitpicks a little bit about George Street to King Street. But he says the clinching argument is, of course, as plain as a pikestaff. Numbers 31 and 34 are opposite each other. Not dead opposite, it's true, but near enough for the sight line to be no more than 15 to 20 degrees off. These two sites are interdependent in terms of the text. Their identification are at once independent and conclusive. Here and nowhere else could that famous vigil have been kept opposite that bright window in the gloom on which the shadow of a man who was seated on a chair within was thrown in hard black outline, a perfect reproduction of Holmes's. Our half-mile search of Baker Street could come to no more happy and reassuring end.
What of the future, he says? Well, both these houses, now at the time he's writing, are fortunately still standing. On the ground floor, number 34 is now a travel agency, in whose office the remains of the plaster frieze of the old front room can still be seen. By strange coincidence, number 31 is largely occupied by another building society, the Alliance Perpetual. What more heaven-sent name could commemorate that immortal partnership? Its yard is now no more. It's been roofed over with glass for many years, overshadowed by a modern cloakroom, but its outline can clearly be seen, and the yard of number 34 still exists, hidden behind the same little mews premises between numbers 12 and 14 Kendall's Place. And the electric lamp bracket occupies the same position on the wall as its Victorian predecessor.
Now, here's where Davies has a little lack of imagination or faith in the Sherlockian movement. He says, though we may never see that great statue of Holmes gazing down Baker Street, it would be a sad thing if the present orgy of bronze casting were allowed to subside without some token being placed on these gallant walls that withstood in turn of revolvers, air guns, and arson. And we should note, if you emerge from Baker Street Station onto Marylebone Road at the corner of Baker Street, there is a bronze statue of Sherlock Holmes. It was placed there in, oh goodness, I want to say sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, and was commemorated by the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. But Davies continues, perhaps a summit meeting of international Sherlockians could be convened in London. In that pleasant atmosphere, squabbles concerning the table could be superfluous. It would, of course, be H-shaped. A boy having been sent down to Stanford's, the maps could be arrayed on it, lines drawn, calculations checked and rechecked, and at last the official recognition could be pronounced. The evidence of the backyards of Baker Street would be upheld. There's little doubt of that. All this would be a relief. The fog would really have lifted. A cold wind may blow down Baker Street. But what matter? A cleaner, better, stronger land will lie in the sunshine when the storm has cleared. For Sherlockians, as for politicians, is that too much to ask?
No, it's not too much to ask. It's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Do you know where we are?
Surely that is Baker Street.
Exactly. We're in the empty house opposite our old quarters.
Why are we here?
Because it commands such an excellent view of that picturesque pile.